Thank you, Eric, and our young Presbyterians and friends. Good to see you all up here this morning, helping us remember the occasion that many of us are celebrating today. I normally follow the lectionary rather religiously, no pun intended, but I cheated a little bit today. The lectionary New Testament readings are guiding us through some Revelation passages, and I selected next week's Revelation passage for our New Testament reading for this week because I thought for our Earth Day service it was especially appropriate. So with that in mind, please hear now the word of the Lord for you and for me this morning from the 21st chapter of Revelation, the first 6 verses. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. God will dwell with them. They will be God's peoples, and God himself will be with them. God will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for these first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." Also he said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." Then he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, Earth Day was the day after Easter, so that's why it got delayed a little bit until this day, which coincides with Mother's Day, but I thought that's kind of appropriate if you think of Mother Earth. It's just one more of the many hats that the earth wears to sustain us, to give us life and living. It kind of fits. Earth Day worship reminds us that the natural world is where life began, and it is something that we in the 21st century need to be reminded to get back into from time to time, to remember it, to value it. And for us in the faith community at Hillsborough Presbyterian Church, to hear today how God would have us relate to it, this earth that we inhabit. This is a rather tough sermon to give on this day in the year 2019. The earth has had a kind of a difficult year. Many of you know what that's like, to have a difficult year. So I've been really thinking hard about the message of judgment and hope that should be in every sermon, but particularly perhaps a sermon on a day that honors the earth. I did a little internet research to try to find out if anybody could guess what the human population was on the earth at the time Psalm 23 was written. Now there's some debate about exactly when this psalm was written. If you concur with those who said King David wrote Psalm 23, it would be about 1000 BC. If you concur with those who believe the psalm was written more in the exilic period, then it would be about 500 BC. So about a 500-year gap that scholars get paid to argue over. And they enjoy that. But between those 500 years, the approximate, from the best I could get online information, would be between 50 million and 100 million people on the planet Earth at that time. Of course, many of you know we're about at 8 billion today. So just imagine when the psalm was being written and there's only 50 to 100 million people over the whole planet, how quiet it was. How many trees there might have been. How many animals? Many more animals than there were people. And the amount of land that did its thing, that had living and dying and the succession of plants and animals without any human impact whatsoever. It's a totally different world to imagine that than it is today, where almost the entire earth has some kind of impact from human use. Whether it's habitat destruction or chemicals, whether or not you believe in the science of human-caused climate change. And I was having a conversation with someone who doesn't believe in the science and yet who admitted to me, there's some real problems with how we're using the earth and the pressure that's on many species in particular. The Extinction Rebellion movement brings our attention to that. So I was thinking of Psalm 23, the beginning, so beautiful and peaceful and hopeful, and now here we are in a world that looks more like Revelation, which talks about the end. Is it? This book of apocalyptic literature that has been interpreted 1 billion different times about the end times. The Psalm reminds us of the beauty and hope of beginnings, and Revelation reminds us of the inevitability of endings. So, the author of Revelation tells us the bad news, like each one of us. For the author, the earth has an end. It will live and it will die, just like each one of us. The good news is the earth, like us, has a resurrection because God's presence is with it, with us. And the hope is that we belong to God in life and in death. We hope for this individually, as a community, and for the whole world. This hope can be a slippery slope of a hope. Because we hope in the new heaven and the new earth, it does not give us the excuse of disparaging the one we have. Some would argue that it does. Just like I see it as having hope in the resurrection for each one of us does not give us the license to disparage the one life we have to live on this earth, as if it didn't matter. It matters very much. And why? The entire biblical witness is not just one person's story. It is an entire epoch of humanity's story. It is the world without end, the Alpha and the Omega. We who live in this time have been handed what others who lived before us had. And we are called to think about what we're going to hand those who come after us, those who we'll never meet. But we're called to think about them. This intensely personal psalm, Psalm 23, was written at a time where being personal and being an individual wasn't even thought of the way we think of it today. You couldn't survive as an individual. You only survived if your community did. And your community included those who had come before you and those who were coming after you. The biblical witness is all about how we think in terms of these communities that aren't just part of our time, but part of all time, the beginning and the end. And that's a very hopeful message for me, growing up in a time when Americans started being called consumers instead of citizens. When I was in seminary, that's always bothered me, even before I went to seminary. So when I was in seminary, I did a little bit of word study on consume, the Hebrew word for this, because it's mentioned quite a few times in the Bible, and I was interested in, what's the biblical image of consumption? It's never good. The Bible speaks, when it's using this Hebrew root for consumption, of God's wrath consuming the earth, of fire consuming the earth, of God consuming a sacrifice that was meant to atone for something wrong. It's never good if consumption is involved. And of course, the old disease, tuberculosis. It used to be an old disease, right? Latest estimates are about 25% of the population today have it. We used to call it consumption. And dying of consumption was not a lot of fun. So you can see where I'm weaving all this together, because I'm just not sure it's been good for us or the earth to become consumers instead of citizens, to become consumers instead of stewards, which is what the shepherd's psalm is all about. How David is called to be a steward because God is his shepherd, to look after the flock that is constantly being born and dying, but continually reconstituted and needs those green meadows, those still waters. The presence of God is a gateway through the earth for the psalmist in Psalm 23. And what is consumption all about anyway? We always joke, whoever gets the most toys wins in the end. That's what it's about, right? If you live as a consumer, your job is to consume and consume. Eat more, have more, travel more. For David, or whoever wrote this 23rd Psalm, the end game was not about that. It was about, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Everything before that was building up to it, and there is nothing after that. That is the end game. David does not say, I shall have more stuff and more money and better experiences that I can put on Facebook than anybody else. The end game for David is dwelling in the house of the Lord forever. Whether that's in the presence of enemies, whether that's in the presence of your most hopeless valley of the shadow of whatever death haunts you, the presence of the Lord goes with you there. This is what David is talking about as a way to live and as an end game for your life. And consumption is not a part of it. And for the Revelation passage that talks about the Alpha and the Omega and the new heaven and the new earth, it does not give us an excuse to not react to wherever we see distress in our environment today, wherever you feel called, whatever you're worried about. There are some of you in this congregation right now who are really worried about insects, about soil degradation, about habitat loss. There are some of you that are devoting your lives to keeping alive the concern for creatures that are not human, that are here as part of God's creation, which sustains us all. So I believe that those concerns, that the concerns that the Bible lifts up, this is why Eric is always telling us stewardship is not just about giving money, it's about the choices we make as Christians to think about those who are coming after us and those who are around us, even if they're not human, what our choices can do to give them as many blessings as we have been blessed with. And it's clear to us today, folks, that consuming until we can consume no more will not lead us to dwell in that house of the Lord forever. And people are getting it. People are getting it. And the church has always had it. If we just lead more in that direction, we can be a sign of hope against all the headlines that scare us and frighten us. Yes, we might start a local chapter of Extinction Rebellion, but even more than that, know that the tradition handed down to us by those who came before us was handed down to sustain a community. Not just us, but those who come after us. And this is the legacy of what our faith tradition asks us to do. Stewardship is nothing more than that. When are we going to have enough to feel like we are enough and that our lives are more than enough? Spiritual contemplation may just have something to say against the world of consumption that gives us life and not death. Amen.